Right, thank you very much, Peter. I have to say, since Peter and John have been involved, it's been a fantastic transformation, the project from our point of view. You can imagine that the games, that the design of the Olympics, the design of the park, when it began entirely with the problem of set by the Olympic Games themselves and the facilities that are required and the flow of people through the space and so on. And as the project has carried on, of course, we've had to find a way of feeding in to a much greater degree the nature of the park in legacy. And so as our client team, if you like, has evolved, it's been possible to push the design much further forward. Like Peter, I sort of feel the need to emphasize at the beginning of talking about the Olympic Park and the Masterplan as a whole, the position of the site within this wider context of the Lee Valley. And that's important because it's a reminder of the scale of the enterprise, of what can be achieved here. That is to say, this continuous link right the way down the Lee Valley to the Thames, but also a sense in which we are part of something much bigger. So we are creating a park, but it's always going to be a park which is seen and understood as part of this sequence of open space which are either pre-exist us or will be created over the forthcoming years. On that plan, the area which is coloured is the area of the site for the games, and the red line is the area which in fact we were asked to look at when we first started working on the project at the bid stage. And I probably should just say here that the team, it's been a team of people working on it. In fact, I think Jason Pryor from EDOR might have been talking to you this evening, and I'm really standing in his place. So it's been a collaboration of a series of different practices who've worked on the project, both at the bid stage and through into this later period. So in fact the project began from our point of view with the job of identifying on which part of the Lee Valley it was possible to consider locating the games, what had the capacity, what was logical in terms of public transport, what was possible in terms of the acquisition of land. And in the end the area that was chosen was the area that lies immediately to the west of Stratford City. That's the Stratford City development there and the new station, leading up to Hackney Marshes in the north and down to the line. You can more or less see the greenway coming through the site here towards the southern side of the site. The site, the Lee Valley, is obviously an extraordinary location. I mean, it's an extraordinary natural landscape on the one hand, with these series of watercourses working their way down from north to south, subdividing, creating a series of islands as they go. And then, of course, it's a site which has been occupied substantially by man. In fact, when you look more in more detail at the landscape itself is largely man-made, the consequence of realigning those waterways, dumping fill into the valleys, putting railways through, putting power cables across it, building sewage pumping stations, and building really substantial areas of industrial development. I mean, people talk about it as being London's backyard, and essentially that is what it has been. And I suppose one of the challenges of the project as a whole is how to let it evolve, because we and lots of other people really think it should change, particularly many people who feel their lives have been constrained by this character, but at the same time acknowledging that it is an important place in terms of somewhere to work, and it has to continue to provide that aspect of the city as well. So you get very extreme contrasts in terms of what you find there at the moment, ranging from pieces of natural landscape which have been allowed to evolve along the length of the waterways to extraordinary consequences of industrial use. In fact, the Fridge Mountain has now disappeared, but it was there when we started the project. And then, of course, historically, some amazing survivals, like the wonderful buildings of 3 mills, and the odd, actually one of our buildings, but it's the sewage pumping station, more recently constructed at Abbey Mills. So in a way, the project, I think fundamental to the project, and I think I've said these words in this room before, but has been to bring together these two aspects simultaneously as one thought about the design. On the one hand, what it was that one was going to build in 2012 for the Olympics, knowing that this is essentially a 2-week period of the Games, followed by the Paralympics immediately afterwards, but nevertheless a very short period of time, a huge investment in terms of construction and reshaping of the valley, but then having to think beyond that to what it would be like in 2025, as that slide says, in terms of the legacy that was going to be left behind, and trying to find the most effective way of shaping the initial investment into something which could have a real utility and value in terms of what was to benefit the people who come to live on the site as a consequence of development that will result within the area of the Olympic Park, but of course perhaps even more important in a way, how it would benefit this wider community of people who already live in the 4 London boroughs which lie at each corner of the site. And part of the project, therefore, began by looking in this wider area. I won't dwell on this in detail, but the planning framework that was done for the wider part of the valley looked at a number of these more significant issues in terms, for example, of employment, of the sort of mix of uses that might go back into the site, dealt with issues of contamination and the various consequences of building on different parts of the site. Looking at the socio-economic context, the qualities of life, if you like, of the people who are living adjacent to the area, looking at how the infrastructure worked today, and this rather shocking fact that there was really only one route across the valley, one main road across the valley at the moment, which wasn't a strategic, a large-scale trunk road, if you like. So there were crossing points, 3 crossing points across the valley for major roads that served the nation, but in terms of actually moving across the valley, if you lived and worked there was really only one road which made that crossing. And so behind the project there has always been the view that one of the things we would do is we would introduce a series of bridges which sometimes cross the waterways, which obviously are one of the barriers, sometimes cross the roads, which also form big barriers to movement, and of course also cross the railways, which themselves form major barriers. So the project, in a way, had this aspect of it, which was a kind of larger scale piece of planning, and then we had to deal with the Olympics themselves. And this diagram, in a way, set out a kind of story for how the Olympics wanted to be, which is to say that in the centre of the site there would be what's called the common domain, where if you're going for the day to the Olympics, where you move around. From there you move into a front of house area where if you're going to see an event in a venue, you're then allowed through. You arrive at the venue. Beyond that, the venue is supported by the back of house where athletes survive, where all the servicing is created. And then outside that, there is a loop road which allows all these different venues to be linked up and indeed linked back to the Olympic Village as well. And that, as you can see, also has a secure perimeter. So in a way there was a kind of a pattern which had to be created to make that work. So these diagrams talk through that story of beginning with the valley, the waterways running through north-south, these very significant east-west crossings formed by the larger scale infrastructure. And the notion that from north-south we would introduce a new green link, which would be essential to the Olympics in terms of movement, but or perhaps more important, a part of this larger strategic network of green space. And if that was to make this transition, then in this particular respect, the park would have to be built over a series of land bridges, which would make the transition over these big roads and railway systems. So in a sense, that was the first key element of the park, that it would be carried over these infrastructure elements. On either side then of the space formed, at the heart of which was this north-south link, would then be the series of venues on either side of the valley with their support areas and with a loop road circulating around the perimeter. You can see on the top the buildings that are currently proposed as part of the Stratford City Masterplan. And then in legacy, the notion that as these venues would come away, some of them being permanent, the main stadium, the aquatics, the velodrome being permanent survivals, benefiting the community, other development would then follow to take the place of some of the temporary venues and the back of house, to begin to frame the space of the park, a space which would have a different size and scale from the space, and character actually, from the space created for the games themselves. In the drawings that were produced to explain this process and moving from the Olympics into legacy, the planning application actually showed a series of white spaces. So you can see in this planning drawing that some of the venues survive. This is actually the area of the press centre, so it's one of the largest buildings that gets built and will also survive or be modified. And this, the Olympic Village here. But then there are areas left which are white on this drawing where subsequent development will take place. And in order to think about that, a lot of speculation has gone on to set out a pattern for the legacy development, which seems to make sense within the site, but also which works very hard to try and draw in the neighbouring communities back into the structure. So areas which are currently, like for example here, which are currently very separate from the Lee Valley, begin to connect into it because of the new road infrastructure which is generated from the new development. Now, the work that we've done on this has been, in a way, very critical to try to make decisions about the park, about the organisation of the Olympics, about the location of infrastructure. And we've gone on to look at the scale and nature of the development, at how plots for development might be located, at land use, at density, and indeed a first go really at thinking about how a bus network might work within the area, cycle networks, the road pattern which we're proposing. I mean, wherever possible, we're anxious to clearly marry the road infrastructure being created for the games with the permanent road infrastructure, although I have to say it's a very complicated thing to achieve. A pedestrian network and then a combined movement network. But what is also true is that one is very aware that this is a process we're talking about here. You know, we can do drawings like this today, but many of these buildings aren't going to be built for 10 or 20 years. And in fact, what I think we're doing here is setting in motion a process which will allow different people to come forward. I know the plan at the moment is to get different practices to look at different sites within the legacy plan and produce more detailed proposals for each of those prior to them then going out to attract people to develop buildings within them. So I think it's a process which will have to grow and change, and it would be foolish, if you like, to be over-specific at this stage. Nevertheless, one of the things we have tried to draw out of the project is the idea that around the park there will be a series of discrete neighbourhoods which will go wider than the individual sites which we can bring forward and connect into what seem to be coherent neighbourhoods at the moment, or emerging, I suppose, in the case of Stratford City. And it would be nice to feel that as each of those different neighbourhoods evolved, so they would begin to generate a different character. And of course, naturally, that is possible because they are likely to have different densities because of their location relative to the transport systems. They're likely to have different uses in response to different views from the local authorities about what should be introduced, and they'll have a different relationship to the park. I mean, we'd like to think they would have a very specific relationship to the park as the designs for individual areas are brought forward. This is one of the areas within the centre of the park as it passes between the stadium on the left, not the real design of the stadium, just an illustration, then one of the new housing areas on the right. And one of the things I suppose that is very interesting to us is to get the balance right between a density of development which is appropriate to this area, appropriate to the mix of housing that we want to provide, which doesn't always mean that it has to be tall buildings with flats, but at the same time recognizing that there is going to be a particular kind of quality which will come out of the relationship between the buildings which surround the park and the nature of the space which they're able to frame. This is the sort of southwestern corner where there's a strip of land between some of the waterways. Central then to the development is the park itself. I'm going to sort of, at some point, John is going to kind of start talking as well, but I'll keep going for a bit. But it may be that there are drawings which you see, John, which you might want to go back to and talk more about. This, in a way, is a kind of diagram of the park, which is really trying to say certain things about its character. But one thing you can see is its curious shape. And I think that is quite significant. It is not a park which has a very strong geometric definition. Indeed, underlying our approach from the beginning has always been the idea that it would have a kind of informality. It would be a park which would somehow evolve out of the natural landscape which we were given. And in terms of scale, it isn't huge either. It's probably worth saying that it's when you overlay this drawing onto St James's Park and Green Park, and you put those together, that's probably about the scale of the park that we're talking about. And the other thing about the park is that as it moves from north to south, it is changing its character. In other words, the type of place that you're in is evolving and changing. As you go to the north, it is a much more rural setting, if you like, and indeed much of the work that is being done to the rivers in that area is to, if you like, naturalize them, to open up what are very steep banks at the moment, create additional flood capacity, which is an important thing we have to achieve. Whereas as you move into the south here, you're moving into a denser urban area. The spaces are tighter, and the whole character of the landscape is likely to be different. When we completed a stage of the project, this was probably about 2 months ago, two drawings were produced to somehow try and describe the nature of the park and the setting. This is obviously a legacy drawing, so I've turned them around for you. So north at the top, north on the right, south on the left. Which set out an idea of the nature of the park, and then a second drawing, which was a drawing showing the nature of the park during the Olympics, the shape of the concourse, the disposition of the various venues on the perimeter. This is the Olympic Village here, the new Stratford City Station here, the existing Stratford City Station over here, with three main entrances into the park, one from Stratford City across two bridges here. This is the aquatics designed by Zaha Hadid here. And then north and south, two of the land bridges, one coming in from an area which will be used for temporary coach parking, and an area and a route in from the south coming from West Ham along the Greenway and then over another land bridge here. And the third land bridge is this one over Carpenter's Road and the railway at the centre of the site. But as we showed this drawing and we talked about it in the group in which we're working, it kind of began to dawn on us that was one of the things that was happening here, which was very intriguing, was that in dealing with the Olympics, we were having to create a kind of a sort of platform on which the Olympics could happen. We had to achieve levels which were commensurate with accessibility across the site, and we had to allow the individual architects and designers of different buildings a degree of flexibility in the way they started to introduce buildings on the site. So as we worked on the landform, we were beginning to create a level which contained all of these venues, and that level was pretty consistent across the site, even though it was lifting up and down as it's made its way over the land bridges. But then below that level was the, if you like, the surviving landscape of the valley, so that there was a kind of natural landscape that was beginning to be revealed, which was left behind, if you like, as you planed off this surface to create the platform. And that way of thinking about the landscape has now been brought forward into the thinking about the park. So whereas before, in a way, the park was the park, it was a landscape which had a kind of continuous feeling across its length. What's emerged is an idea about a park which is really existing on two levels. There's an upper level, which is this platform created by the games, and then there's a lower level, which is the level of the rivers and the waterways, where the towpaths work their way through, and where there's an opportunity for a different type of landscape intervention to be made. And the bridges, which then span from side to side, are really seen not as bridges which link two sides of a valley, but bridges which carry the landscape across the valley as a continuum. So that in the I'm sorry, these are very sort of washed out slides. In the Olympics, just to go back, I don't think you can see it, probably not. There's the concourse is created, the edge of which is framed by the individual buildings. And then in Legacy, what happens is that upper area then expands out again as the temporary buildings come out to create the wider landscape of the park. And so what is survived from the Olympics is something which is highly particular. It's highly particular to the topography of the site and the moves that have been made by the Olympics to create it. And it's highly particular in terms of the interventions that are made, the bridges, the scale of the bridges, which allow the different sides of the valley to interconnect during the games. And in Legacy, and the bridges is one of the things which we've been looking at more recently, because the bridges in nearly every case have to carry both a permanent bridge, which is left behind, and a temporary bridge, which substantially expands the scale of the bridge during the games. And what we're looking at the moment is, wherever possible, to introduce pairs of permanent bridges as the way in which these big-scale moves are made across the valley. And that allows us to put between the pairs of bridges the temporary bridges which go in and out for the games, but it means that before the games we can construct all the abutments and all the landscape at the lower level. So there's the opportunity, in a way, to design the park in two stages, to design and create the lower level park as something which is created in full when the Olympics opens, and then the upper level of the park is something which has this opportunity to evolve over a longer period of time. I'll just whiz through these, I think. So that notion of the cross-section through the landscape is something which is beginning now to inform a lot of the thinking about the design of the park, and the way in which the particular form of the landscape will begin to evolve. I'll stop, but just to say one last thing. Clearly, one of the biggest questions is how the waterways themselves are dealt with within this landscape. Sometimes they are being naturalized, if you like, so we're opening up a greener landscape than exists at the moment. Sometimes we're working with the existing river walls, which we're repairing and restoring. So in a sense, there will be areas where there is a greater sense of a reading of the archaeology of the site as it is. Sometimes new walls are being created, so that there are different responses within different parts of the site. And the different characters, therefore, begin to come through in the way in which these different sites are dealt with. This is a beach in the wetlands area, in the northern part of the site, where the river banks are opened up. This is Henniker's Ditch, where the landscape is very steep. Moving south into the areas where the waterways are more contained, the towpaths are closer together, but still there are green edges to the waterways. This is one of the new bridges. In fact, this is one of the bridges which is now the subject of an architectural competition, and then one of the existing bridges being retained. And then as you move further south again, the character of the waterways, their use as well, might begin to evolve again. That's getting nearer to the aquatic centre there. So the project is evolving. I mean, some of these drawings are drawings that have just been done very recently. I'm sure it will evolve again. A lot of things I've talked about are things which will keep changing. But obviously, as every month goes by, there's less opportunity to change. Because on site now, some of this work is beginning to be built. Some of the bigger engineering work is just beginning. And so the design process is gradually becoming more and more fixed. I think what I should do is hand over to John at that point.